Welcome, everybody. I'm Mike Wright. I'm Director of Membership and Communications at Bond, and welcome to this webinar that we're hosting in conjunction with Hayes McIntyre. Just want to go through some bit of housekeeping. So the session's being recorded. The recording will be available afterwards, and we'll send all the slides to you for your use. There are captions available, so just find those to turn them on. There'll be lots of opportunity during the course of the session to ask questions. Either drop them into the chat box or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. If you can tell us which organisation you're from and your job title, who you are, that will be really helpful in terms of us understanding your context. And then later in the session, we'll post a feedback form in the chat. Be really delighted to hear your views of the session and what you think about it. Just quickly, I just wanted to say thank you to Hayes McIntyre. We've got a long-standing relationship with them, and that partnership is really focused on issues of financial management and organisational structuring, particularly in the context of organisations being more locally led, and what these sort of seismic changes to our sector is seeing in the way that organisations operate, and that speaks to sort of the fundamental parts of this section that we're going to run today. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew Roberts of Hayes Mac. He's going to guide you through the rest of the session. So thank you, Andrew.
Mike, good afternoon, everybody. Just welcome to this session on cross-border challenges for NGOs. I'm Andrew Roberts. I'm here representing Hayes McIntyre. I work in our charity not-for-profit team, and my sort of specialist area is those charities working internationally. So I think I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers as much as everyone else. We've got five speakers lined up today. Give some insight from various different perspectives. Certainly amongst my clients, sort of that cross-border challenges, localization projects, very hot topic at the moment. So like I said, looking forward to hearing from everybody. And after each speaker, we've got about 5 minutes allocated for questions, so do feel free to put them in the Q&A box, or otherwise use the raise a hand function if you want to just ask, and then we'll, after that 5 minutes, we'll quite quickly move on to the next speaker. So yeah, I think I'll hand over now to Nick Bustin, who's our first speaker.
Thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm again from Hayes McIntyre. I head up our employment taxes team. And over the last few years, been working quite a lot with a variety of clients on moving individuals overseas. Could I have the next slide, please? And just a few things that really I think NGB should be thinking about. Now, in this context, I think we're seeing more NGOs sort of allowing their employees to sort of, if they're going on holiday, spending time working in that country, maybe a few extra weeks, particularly if they're staying with family members. But we're seeing a real trend in changing of work patterns. And this has been quite topical. As Andrew was saying, a number of his clients, these issues have been very much the things that have been raised with him over the last few months. Very high level set of summaries we're going to go through. Think about what the regulatory issues are in the country where that person's going to work, what you may need to think about in terms of having some sort of structured policy. It doesn't have to be a heavy bound document, but I think some clear guidelines where you have people going to work overseas as part of their enhanced sort of holiday period. But also, if you're looking at, you've got employees that are working sort of delivering frontline activities in another country. Quite often we will see organisations that will look at recruiting locally, but equally they do need to send people on secondment to work in those countries, or send people over there to just for a short term to sort of have a high level overview as to how the organisation is working in that host country, but also to maybe help up set up the NGO in that host country. You know, quite often we'll start to get queries that come from clients saying, I've got someone on the UK payroll, but they've been working in another country for more than a year. Should I still keep them on the UK payroll? And the simple answer to that is no. but you then need to consider what the correct reporting obligations are in that host country. Before I move on to the next slide, there is quite a topical piece that I've been speaking with a number of clients about, and that's around something called employer of record. Many organisations will use this. It's effectively, this may not be the correct technical term, but I look at it as like a type of agency agreement where you may have someone working in another country and the employer of record provider effectively deals with payroll management and HR management. Now, they're quite useful if you've got a number of lone individuals working in those countries. However, one of the things I do get commented on fairly regularly is that clients find employer of record to be quite expensive and sometimes not as responsive as they would like. But they do serve a very good purpose, and I would certainly explore that option if you're looking at maybe one or two individuals working overseas for a limited period. There's always a little bit of a health warning whenever anyone is working overseas, and you want to make sure that their presence isn't unnecessarily going to create what's called a permanent establishment in the host country. So in effect, give you a presence which could create a corporate or business tax reporting obligation for you. Could I have the next slide, please? So I like to sort of keep things nice and simple. I put things into like 3 bundles. If you've got people that are working on short-term assignments, so maybe they're on holiday and adding on a few weeks to their holiday to be able to carry on some work, so long as that period of time doesn't exceed 183 days, then I think you can work with a degree of confidence that you won't create a tax reporting obligation. However, I would say you do need to check what the regulations are in the host country. One example where that isn't quite so straightforward is Canada. So if you're a non-resident employer, Revenue Canada's starting position is you should operate a payroll. Now, there is the opportunity to enter into a waiver agreement, but that's the one noticeable country where we do see clients allowing employees to work unaware of that obligation. Then looking at sort of medium and long-term arrangements, and this is where people are sort of working on providing the frontline services in that host country. So anything up to 3 years I would call medium, and so there are some things you need to think about. Longer term, again, there's a higher degree of integration into the host country. So again, some further things that need to be looked at. What have I been speaking to clients about? So certainly for the sort of shorter term arrangements, the employer's not going to provide any enhancements. They're not going to pay for any travel or subsistence or any other costs. In effect, it's permitting the employee to work there. And so long as it doesn't create any reporting obligations for the employer, I think employers have been generally happy. A couple of clients I have been working with have tried to structure arrangements to ensure that employees are fully aware of how far they can go in terms of what the employer will deem to be acceptable in terms of that working time. Now, one thing we need to be conscious of, I've given the example of payroll in Canada, is we also need to just think about what other sort of deadlines or time frames clients should think about. And certainly post-Brexit, we need to be aware that UK citizens can't be present in an EU country for more than 91 days, a rolling 183-day period. Now, that's an employment law issue and a right of residence in that country, but factor that into potential tax reporting obligations. It's a good measure, and it's also a good way to ensure that you're not creating a taxable presence in that country. We compare that to the medium and long-term employee assignments where there is the employer will pay enhanced subsistence costs and provide financial support. From a tax perspective, there are 2 things that we'll look at, tax equalisation and tax protection. So can I have the next slide, please? So before I pop onto those particular points, I've already mentioned that we need to consider host country rules. And again, a couple couple of clients have been very surprised when I said, well, actually, we have quite different tangible tax positions to consider. So in countries like France, they give tax relief on the social security contributions that are paid. In the Netherlands, there's a specific exemption where they're trying to encourage people to actually move to Holland to perform work. That's the 30% tax relief. And then only last week, I was advising a client who's got employees that are moving to India, where they've introduced about 10 years ago a fringe benefits regime, but it's the employer's responsibility for settling the tax due on those benefits. So again, these are all things that can have a bearing on the sort of financial costing behind allowing someone to work in that country. Can I have the next slide, please? So I mentioned tax equalisation. You're trying to encourage someone to go and work in the other country, and you want to provide that individual with a degree of comfort. So under a tax equalisation policy, the individual will not pay any more tax than they would have done if they'd stayed here in the UK. So for the employer, what does that mean? Well, if there's any additional tax on the sort of tax differential between the UK standard rates and the host country standard rates, there are true costs to the employer, as well as the benefits that may be provided, so accommodation, maybe return flights, and the knock-on tax consequences that are associated with the provision of those benefits. The employee's contribution towards the arrangement is effectively equal to the amount of tax they would have suffered in the UK. If they're going to be outside the UK for more than a year, it's not true tax, it's what's called hypothetical tax. That effectively goes into the employer's pot for them to be able to have the cash to be able to spend on the provision of those benefits. Have the next slide, please. Now, there are some advantages and again, disadvantages. I think the advantages are all leaning towards the assignee, the person you really want to ensure is focusing on the work that you're sending them to the host country to undertake. So they're going to be no worse off. They're not going to have any financial surprises. And so it helps them to manage their own expectations. For the employer, I think the bottom line is it can be quite costly to send people on a tax equalisation arrangement. But equally, there are some tax savings where maybe the host country's net tax cost is less than that of the UK. Can I have the next slide, please? Tax protection is another way that several employers send people abroad. And in effect, instead of the employer being heavily involved in dealing with the local revenue authority and paying those taxes, it sits with the employee. But the employee will only incur tax due based on the lower taxing, whether it's the home or host country regime. This can mean that there are some tax mismatches because obviously the UK has a very different tax year to most other countries, which is done on a calendar year basis. So what we do see is employers providing some financial support, maybe through a loan, which enables the employee to pay the cost of the additional tax due. And once the UK tax position has been reconciled, then that will offset against the loan. So there are some sort of behind the scenes management things that people need to think about. Have the next slide, please. So again, the advantages and disadvantages are summarised in the table. No real financial surprises for the employee because they pay the tax at the lowest rate in either the host or home country. But one of the challenges I've seen for clients over the years is actually trying to get someone to move to a higher tax jurisdiction under a tax protection policy can prove a little bit more challenging. Can I have the next slide, please? I think one of the biggest areas of challenge really when we're looking at people moving abroad is social security. And we need to be mindful that in many countries, the amount that they collect from social security is higher than it is in the UK. And that's despite the current rumours that UK employers' national insurance is likely to go up in the budget. But then we have the UK has three types of social security relationship. We have our relationship with our European Union colleagues and EEA countries. we have reciprocal agreement countries, and then we have what's called the rest of the world countries. So with the EU countries, even post-Brexit, we can get something called an A1 certificate. There are a few more administrative hurdles to get over. But in effect, it means if you've got an employee working in a EU or EEA country, then they can stay in the UK national insurance system for up to 2 years. So again, that helps to manage short-term assignments and any period up to 24 months. Reciprocal agreement countries, of which there are about 26, 27, works on the same basis, but because most of those countries are, say, slightly further afield, like the US, Canada, and New Zealand, then that 2-year period you transfer over to a 5-year period. Now, the one exception to those countries is Australia, where the reciprocal agreement is currently null and void. It's been suspended, has been since the early 80s, and is unlikely to be reenacted for many years to come. So if you're sending anyone to Australia, you need to then look at them in the context of the rest of the world rules. Now, our base principles for social security in the UK and in the EU reciprocal agreement countries is that you pay national insurance or social security in the country in which you are habitually resident. And habitually resident is loosely defined is where you typically would live, and with a measure attached to that of a 52-week period. So if you're sending someone to a rest of the world country, then for the first 52 weeks of any period they're sent away, they will stay in the UK national insurance system. As soon as they tip into the 53rd week, they then fall outside of the UK national insurance system. Same when they come into the UK, they have to wait 52 weeks before coming into the UK NI system. Now, there needs to be a bit of care there because they may have social security obligations in the host country. And again, that needs to be carefully considered because some of those countries will have more superannuation fund orientated arrangements with bolt-on medical insurance cover. And that's typically what they have in place in countries like Australia, South Africa, and India. Can I have the next slide, please? Just a brief summary, just to give you some examples of national insurance rates. So I did a little exercise for a client about 3-4 months ago, where they were looking at where employees were typically going to go. And you could see that at the moment, the UK is sort of middling. Certainly we're behind the US and Ireland in terms of the national insurance rates. Again, tax rates are fairly middling as well. But if we take other countries, particularly France and Japan, significantly higher. If you take some other countries in the list of, well, the more strategically challenged countries, tax rates are probably lower than the UK's, but then social security rates are enhanced because there are the need to pay for some sort of Medicare type arrangements as well. So this also, you need to factor in the sort of costs of sending someone abroad where they're on a longer term assignment project. Can I have the final slide, please? I mentioned permanent establishment earlier on. So this is a very brief summary of permanent establishment. It doesn't cover all of the tests. But certainly when I contact one of our alliance partner firms, when I'm talking to them about prospective clients sending employees to that country, their focus is on, will this create some sort of corporate presence? And it's quite key to them because they want to ensure that they're actually getting the right level of recovery of tax by someone working in that country. Now, if that person doesn't have sort of senior sign-off reporting obligations or sales development or development program responsibilities, then it's highly unlikely they're going to create a permanent establishment. I'll give an example. A client who's in the education sector, during the pandemic, they suddenly discovered a very senior member of staff decided to move to the family home in Croatia. Croatia has a very narrow view on permanent establishment. And for someone that had no real presence in Croatia, suddenly they had a real perspective of creating a corporate presence. Because that person was senior enough, they were basically signing off everything that the organisation was doing, also signing off all contracts, all third-party supplier arrangements. So the client had to quickly switch off that ability for that individual to sign anything off to help protect their position. And that was a conversation that was replicated quite a bit during the pandemic. But even now, I'm having conversations with clients where senior members of staff are looking to relocate to their home country, and what changes need to be brought in place at the NGO to protect them from creating that permanent presence. That's a very broad summary, very, very high level. I hope that's given people some food for thought. And if anyone's got any questions, happy to field them.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. If anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box or use the raise a hand function, and then we can unmute you to talk. Just wait and see if anything comes through.
I think so far. Excellent. I've baffled everyone.
Yeah, there's one question come in for you, Nick. Why would NGOs have to worry about permanent establishment if we are tax exempt?
Yeah, you may be tax exempt in the UK, but again, it's the need to be able to consider what the local jurisdiction legislation could be. So the example I gave of Croatia, that was a charity, and their charitable activities in the UK were less than 83,000. But in Croatia, that threshold didn't exist. So again, it's a need to ensure that you're looking at host country local regulations just to get the comfort that you aren't creating something unnecessarily.
And then the second question is, are employer of record costs subject to VAT? Maybe.
I genuinely don't know the answer to that. What I will do is I'll ask one of our VAT team, because if it's a supplier services, it could be. I'll check with one of our VAT colleagues, and what I'll do is I'll share that response with Bond and arrange for that to be circulated with the slide pack. That's a good question. Thank you.
I think we've just got time for the last question there. If someone goes to a country where withholding tax applies, Ghana in this case, but we have no presence there, is withholding tax due in Ghana?
If we're talking about employees of withholding tax that would be broadly similar to pay as you earn, then yes. And actually, that's a question that came up with a client yesterday, but not in Ghana, but within one of these neighbouring countries. And looking at some of the guidance, the obligation does rest with non-resident employers as well in many of the African countries. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Nick.
Okay, thank you.
That takes us to time, so I'll just hand over now to Jen.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So, hi everybody. I am Jen Codman, and I work as the Global People Lead at International Budget Partnership. And just for a bit of context, we are a not-for-profit registered in the US. We have about 70 staff based around the world, with country offices in the US, South Africa, Senegal, Nigeria, and Indonesia. And we also have a lot of completely remote workers. And so today I'm just going to be talking a little bit about how to support cross-border and remote working, particularly in NGOs. And I'll be discussing some of the challenges that I've seen, and also sharing a little bit about how I think we can address some of the issues and sort of embrace decolonisation in our sector. Next slide, please. So first of all, I just wanted to explore a little bit about why cross-border working is critical. And, you can see some of the kind of points that I've made on the slide here. I think we're seeing more and more that organisations are expanding their global footprint. And for many organisations, this is about ensuring that they can tap into diverse global talent and expand their talent pool. This is really important, I think, particularly in mission-driven organisations where we want to get the right person in for a role, and that's really critical and has a significant impact on organisational performance. Obviously, following the COVID-19 pandemic, we also saw the global trend towards remote working. This really accelerated, and I think NGOs particularly embraced this as well in order to kind of balance flexibility whilst maintaining kind of day-to-day operations. And we've also seen in the narratives around decolonisation that there's a real desire and a need to empower local voices and decentralise decision-making away from kind of Western-centric leadership models. And this often has involved moving people and positions from the global north to the global south. So as you can see, there are lots of reasons why moving to a globally remote setup would be kind of advantageous to many organisations. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to briefly kind of reflect on the importance of cross-border working within the decolonisation agenda. And I'm sure that this will not necessarily be new to many of you, but I think it's just important to kind of touch on this briefly and kind of make the point. I think we do need to do more in the sector to decentralise power, particularly in kind of global organisations, moving leadership away from the traditional global north, Western headquarters and empowering local teams. And this can be hard. It takes a real commitment from the executive team and often also the board of trustees as well. And we really need to kind of embrace this and think about how we can do this and how it can be done. And, you know, this doesn't always have to be about kind of massive organisational restructures where you make all the staff in the global north redundant and relocate roles to the global south. But I do think we have to start preparing our teams and preparing ourselves to set the expectation with staff that we might need to make strategic decisions about where best to place an organisation's resources. And that might involve moving roles to different geographies. And by moving decision-making roles into the communities where we work, we're better placing ourselves to set up more equitable partnerships. So ultimately, reducing the reliance on the global north leadership, we can be more responsive to the communities that we serve and draw on local expertise. And what we're seeing is that we'll get more local staff in to lead on programme design, implementation, and there'll be really positive outcomes on the ground and having a greater impact overall. And so for many organisations, this shift is already happening, which is brilliant. But I think we can always do more to encourage senior leadership to take proactive steps to dismantle these power dynamics. And ensuring your organisation is set up and can effectively accommodate a globally remote workforce will really help with this, I think. Next slide, please. So here I've just highlighted some of the practical challenges that NGOs face when managing teams that are spread out and not all in one place. You know, there are logistical hurdles, regulatory differences, varying access to resources, and all of this kind of makes this type of work challenging. And day-to-day operations can really slow down when you have to make decisions with teams who are in different time zones. So it's really critical to kind of invest in the organisational infrastructure and to establish ways of working that can help you overcome these challenges. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you my 5 top tips that have really helped me in the different organisations that I've worked in, and hopefully they can help you too. And full disclaimer, nothing here is new, but hopefully it will give you some reassurance that you are on the right path. So my first top tip is just really to review and look at the infrastructure and communication systems that you've got in place and assess if they really truly support and enable remote teams to thrive. Now, for some remote staff, you might need to consider purchasing additional data for their phones, their internet, or ensuring access to office space. And again, this doesn't need to be kind of across the board offer. It can be just provided to those staff and teams that really need it and where access to reliable internet is an issue. Just as an example, in the last week, our executive director at IBP, she's based in Ecuador, and they've had massive power outages there where there's just been no power from sort of 9 in the morning till 9 at night, and we've had to put some additional arrangements in place. So there are also some cloud-based platforms that can also facilitate global working, you know, the obvious things like Google Workspace, Microsoft 365. And we also need to think a little bit, I think, about the importance of cybersecurity and how you're going to protect sensitive data across a dispersed workforce. We all know that communication is key to having a productive workforce, particularly as we increase our virtual teams. So there are, again, lots of different communication tools out there that can aid communication. So speak to your colleagues, ask them what they would recommend and what they're comfortable using. And I'd also really recommend investing in good onboarding around what systems and software you use, and don't make the assumptions about what people will know or be familiar with. Again, this was a bit of a game changer for us at IBP, particularly as we expanded our operations out to the US. And I think for a while we'd really made the assumption that people were comfortable using a particular software or an application, but we realized that a large population, mainly our non-US based workforce, were just not as familiar with these applications. And so we really had to focus on doing one-on-one sessions with them to improve their use of that communication tool. And it really changed the engagement between the virtual teams. And a lot of people also come into just on how valued it made them feel as an individual too. And again, I think just setting clear expectations about how we wanted our teams to communicate and update people on their work, even down to kind of making sure they would update their online calendars so people could easily schedule meetings with them. Again, really important kind of things to just make sure that everybody aware is. So, we really tried to establish this is how we will work and this is our kind of ways of working. We also try to over communicate organisation updates and announcements to ensure that everyone is kind of on the same page and feel that they're tuned into the organisational pulse. And we also spent a lot of time trying to establish a culture of flexibility, which is again really important. So that's just making those small adjustments to accommodate team members in different time zones will kind of really improve your internal communications massively. Next slide, please. Great. So my second top tip is to just really recognise that legal and compliance issues such as differing tax, employment laws and benefit structures can make cross-border working really complex. And we've heard some of that already in today's session. So just, really encourage you to go and get the good advice, understand how to navigate the different legal frameworks that you operate within. Setting up a kind of partnership with local legal advisors, making use of HR platforms that specialise in international compliance is also really important. I know a lot of you will be interested in using PEOs to act as the employee of record for many of your teams. And again, I think it's just really important to spend some time reviewing the different providers that are out there to see what will work best for you. There are hundreds of different providers that all provide the same type of service. So kind of, have a look what's out there, get some recommendations. At IBP, we recently did a review and we had about 10 different PEOs that we were partnering with. And we're now in the process of moving a large proportion of our staff, probably about 80%, to be under one PEO. And this was partly to do with cost, as we got better rates for having more employers under one PEO, but also just in terms of the day-to-day management. We feel we're better supported from a customer service perspective now because we've got more staff under the same PEO. And we're also spending less admin time managing the kind of different relationships. For instance, just managing one invoice, one payroll approval versus multiple when we had lots of different providers. So again, go and do the homework on which would be a suitable one for your organisation. We've also really tried to standardise wherever possible the different ways that we employ someone. So creating standardised contracts and working conditions, but again, ensuring that local norms such as kind of leave and benefits are also respected and acknowledged. So my third tip is just to ensure your workforce are able to recognise and accommodate cultural differences in terms of communication styles, decision-making processes, work habits. Raising awareness of the different approaches is really important and can really help to reduce some of the friction that, might be there within teams. And I'd really recommend creating a space for ongoing cultural awareness training and learning for teams so that they can speak a little bit about the differences and what's important to them. And again, this doesn't always have to be through formal training. It can just be about providing a space for people to come together and connect on a particular topic and share their kind of approaches. Encourage inclusive communication where everyone has a voice, regardless of location or cultural background, and encourage sensitivity to local customs, like, for instance, public holidays or meeting etiquette. Again, nothing particularly new here, but just really important steps, I think, to kind of do that regular review and analysis of how you're working. Next slide, please. So my fourth top tip, again, might be really obvious, but you really need to invest in building trust and fostering accountability across borders. I think some practical things you can do across the organisation is to shift the focus away from tracking hours to tracking kind of outcomes and results. So again, one of the things, just to share an example of what we've been doing at IBP, is to try and stop over communicating on micro movements. And I'm not sure if you'll have heard that kind of term before, but essentially this is where teams are constantly updating you on what they're doing, when they're going to be offline, when they're stepping out for lunch, when they're going to an appointment. And whilst it's really important, I think, to communicate your availability, we can overdo this. And what it actually does is place an emphasis on being seen as at your desk, which in turn kind of fosters this sense of needing to show that you are working your contracted hours. And what we really want to do is shift the focus to outcomes and achievements. So we need to do, less of this and trust that people are actually doing their jobs. We need to ensure people own their work and that the wider team understand their goals and priorities. So again, having shared organisational goals or team goals can be really helpful. And I'd also recommend using project management tools for tracking tasks and progress, which can, really help with transparency and accountability without kind of having all the micromanagement that often surrounds that. And there are lots of different tools out there to use, but again, they often come with a cost. So sometimes that can make them less attainable for people in the NGO sector and not-for-profit space. The next slide, please. And so my final top tip number 5, is just to ensure that you'll support wellbeing in your remote teams. So NGOs really need to ensure that they are doing all they can to support the wellbeing of their remote employees, especially given the challenges of cross-border working. Things like time zone fatigue and also isolation for staff who don't work in an office are really prevalent and can really result in burnout for some individuals. So I think it's important to offer flexible working schedules and encourage people to manage their own workloads effectively, recognising that we all have a life outside of work and other commitments. So these could be caring responsibilities, but also just, hobbies, things that we want to maintain. So it's just really important to encourage, I think, flexibility wherever possible and work on the basis of trust first. So if you can invest in mental health resources and wellness initiatives, again, I'd also really recommend you doing that. This will ensure staff feel supported and make sure that they are easy to use and accessible. For instance, an employee assistance program, making sure that it's not just available in English, it might be accessible in other languages as well as needed. And again, just make sure your managers really understand things like your sick leave policies and other policies that you have in place to support your teams, and encourage them to use these. And again, just as an example, at IBP, we've really encouraged staff to use sick days, also for mental health days. So not just, for kind of physical illnesses. And this has been really well received and has meant staff can take some time off following really particularly busy periods of work, or if they're responding to something kind of emergency situation where they've had to kind of go above and beyond usual hours. So again, that can be really important. And I think that pretty much sums up everything that I wanted to speak about. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has got any.
We've got one question coming already. It says, how do you manage salaries for different roles across the globe? Are they locally benchmarked, or did you use a different methodology?
Yeah, great. Really great question. And I could have put a whole presentation on that. We're actually in the middle of a compensation review that I've been leading. And, I think every organisation does this differently, but IBP traditionally was a US-based entity with lots of workforce in the US, and we expanded out of that and had a more global footprint. And we kind of made some salary adjustments to try and better fit, I guess, local markets. But in the recent compensation review, we have been utilising local NGO salary services surveys. We've been utilising Birch's service, which is a really good NGO non-profit sector salary kind of benchmarking tool. And that is allowing us to decide and make decisions with our ET on where do we want to position ourselves within the local market, whether we want to have salaries that are the same, equal, or whether we want to adjust them to be equitable and kind of based on the local market. And so we have been moving our salaries to local market positions. I think what's also really important, just to reflect as well on that a little bit, is establishing a really good compensation philosophy. So making sure that you have really put together a really transparent document that sets out your approach to compensating staff, how you make the calculations in different countries, how people can progress, what are your policies on kind of promotion, performance-based bonuses, salary adjustments, etc. Making sure that's all in place so that staff feel that, it's a really transparent process and nothing is kind of being hidden. I think that's also really important.
Okay. I'm just a bit conscious of time. I think we'll take one more quickly. It says, I'd like to hear or learn more about how we could decolonize policies to support cross-border working and equal treatment, where we have single policies that speak to different regions?
Yeah, so again, I mean, I don't think I necessarily have the answer on this, but I'll just maybe speak briefly about what we've been doing at IVP. And so again, we tended to have very US focused policies. And as we've moved out, we've kind of adapted them a little, but hadn't been really great at kind of documenting them. So staff would be accessing a US centric policy on our kind of SharePoint site and, trying to figure out how that, adapted to their context and their situation. And so one of the things that we're actually trying to do more of now is have a global policy, but specifically state in that there may be a local policy that they should, look at and consider. We've been working with our local teams in places where we're registered to kind of essentially map out what a local policy for them would look like. So taking the global policy and then kind of adapting it and making changes to reflect actually, any statutory compliance that we need to have and reflect in the local context so that their staff can just go to that as their resource. I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but it's just kind of one example that we've been doing it.
Right, thanks. A couple more questions, but I think we'll leave those for now. And if we've got time at the end, we'll come back just to keep the time. So thanks, Jen. And I will just introduce Andrew.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. My name's Andrew Studd. I'm a partner in the charity and social business team at Russell Cook, and very pleased to give you some input on the cross-border challenges. If I could have the first slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Thanks. And if you could put, yes, perfect. That's it. Thank you very much. So, I mean, there are a myriad, and I'm very pleased that Nick and Jen have already mentioned local regulations and local laws and local registrations, etc., because a lot of this is going to be driven by what the law in the local jurisdiction actually is. But I think first things first, I'm looking at this very much from a UK trustee perspective, where I am implementing a project in an overseas jurisdiction, and what are my concerns for the UK charity? What is my responsibility? Who am I accountable to? So I think the first question I'd be asking is, what's actually going on in country? Is it us acting through a local entity in that country? Do we control that entity? Are we ourselves actually operating there as a branch? Maybe we've got some people posted there. Maybe the local jurisdiction requires that if you do have people there for over the particular period, which might create a permanent establishment, that you have to register as some form of branch, or you have to register as an NGO when you're there as part of your visa requirements or something along those lines. Or are we working with a local organisation, a local partner? And obviously, the local partner or the local entity is probably going to be easier to work with for many risk reasons, but also it supports the sort of locally led agenda and the decolonisation agenda, I think. So as I mentioned, local laws may come in all sorts of different shapes and guises. There is a common law jurisdiction, a bit like the UK, where the law has been built up over years and years, where if you enter into a contract, you usually expect the contract to prevail over, as long as it's compliant with the law, but the contract speaks for itself. In other jurisdictions, civil law jurisdictions, sometimes the law can interfere with what you believe your contractual relationship should be. So you do need to understand what the local regime is all about and what it's saying. As I say, there may be registration and license requirements which restrict which approach you can take to the country, i.e. whether you're operating through a subsidiary or a local entity. I won't talk about the tax implications. As you can see, there are already a number of points that have been raised, and I'll leave that to Hayes McIntyre and others. I think from the UK perspective, you can obviously influence arrangements either via a contract, or because if you have a subsidiary entity, you can control that by having the ability to appoint directors, or to have your own people running the project in country. If you're working through a partner, then obviously the partner has its own control mechanisms. It's accountable to other people. So one of the reasons to consider operating through a subsidiary is you can control the entity itself, and that gives you more control through the sort of supply chain. And that leads to the funds flow. Usually, UK trustees will be concerned because they've got funds from DFID or from some other trust and foundation where they are accountable both to the funder, to the Charity Commission and to HMRC to be able to demonstrate how that money has been applied for the charity's purposes. So understanding how the funds are flowing and how you remain accountable for those funds is clearly important. If I could have the next slide, please. So a subsidiary from the UK trustees' perspective is very helpful. A subsidiary is a legal entity set up in the local jurisdiction, and usually, but again, subject to the local laws, it will have limited liability. Most companies have sort of two layers of control. One is the shareholder or the member that, quote, owns the company, and those shareholders or members appoint the board of directors or the trustees to run the entity for them. So if you are creating a subsidiary, you will usually be the sole shareholder or one of a small number of shareholders or members if it's a not-for-profit organisation. You, as shareholder, usually benefit from limited liability. So you're not responsible for the activities going on the ground. That is the legal entity's obligation. It employs people. It enters into contracts with the local organisations to deliver your project. So the question then comes down to what sort of governance and control do I have? Essentially, from the shareholders' perspective, from the UK charities' perspective, you have the right to appoint and remove directors if it works in the same way as the UK would. So that obviously means that you can control indirectly what that entity does. Much easier than having a very extensive contract where you've got to write down who does what each moment of the day. And then you also have a question about whether you can enforce that contract in the local country. In this instance, because you control the entity, you can do what you need it to do. So it has two advantages. It protects the parent charity from direct liability from the operational activities, but it also makes doing what you want to be done easier. There are obviously various local laws which apply to can you actually wholly control an entity in that jurisdiction, and does that jurisdiction does it require that you have local directors? Now, again, for the locally led reason, you may well want lots of local directors, but you may also want a couple of UK-based directors or other trusted persons who can sit on the board, understand the decisions that are being reached, and feedback to you that way. So I know, for example, in India, there are various sectors of the economy that you cannot invest more than 50%, more than 49% in certain companies, and that you have to have local directors for certain activities. So while you have the benefit of control, you have the benefit of limited liability, there will be local restrictions that require how you operate that entity. Clearly, initially, you're going to need some money to set this thing up. You can usually provide that either by way of a grant or by way of a loan. But again, places like India, there are restrictions on capital flows, and you may need to get consent from, in India, the Reserve Bank of India, to remit monies into the country. Ongoing funding and accountability to funders. From this perspective, I'm back to I'm holding money on behalf of DFID or somebody like that. I'm applying it to a project. I have to be accountable to DFID and to HMRC and to the Charity Commission to ensure those funds are spent correctly in accordance with the project plan, etc. Despite the fact that you would own that entity, I think you still need an agreement in place, a grant agreement or a cooperation agreement of some sort, which explains how you are doing. Thank you for that comment. Yes, FCDO. Sorry, you can tell how old-fashioned I am. But your accountability to funders remains. You'll need a contract of some description which directs how that subsidiary entity is going to apply the money. Certainly a subsidiary will also create a permanent establishment, so it will become responsible for its own tax. Could I have the next slide, please? So a branch can form in all sorts of ways. In the UK, you can establish a branch. You generally have to register at Companies House to say, I've established a branch, and file accounts and do things like that. But you can, a branch is a broader statement whereby you don't create a separate legal entity, but it's really you, the UK charity that is operating, or the UK not-for-profit that's operating on the ground in country. That means that you don't have any separation from what you're doing in the UK and what you're doing in the overseas jurisdiction. That makes it fairly difficult for UK trustees to really know what's going on in country. You have to have a lot of oversight, and that will all have to be done by people reporting to people. Again, I think you will probably need some form of understanding between those operating on the ground, some terms of reference as to what they can and cannot do with their own authority, and what needs to get reported back and approved by the UK Trustee Board or UK Senior Management. So it's more, there is no protection from liabilities that arise from your activities in that country. So you need to be very much more careful about what you delegate and how things are approved and agreed budgets and all those sorts of things. As I've already mentioned, there may well still be registration obligation, and you'll still have to comply with local laws. That makes it quite difficult if you've got various policies. Talking about anti-corruption or anti-bribery laws, you've got a regime that you have to comply with in the UK, but because you are also operating in country, you've got to comply with those laws as well. And I think that falls down to sort of having global policies and local policies, as Jen was alluding to. You'll need to make sure that those are all in place. And again, because you're not actually, you don't have a legal entity in the local jurisdiction, you'll need to consider how you do go about employing staff. Are you seconding people perhaps to a partner organisation? Are you using an employer of record? So how are you going to manage that process? I think that's all I wanted to say on one other point. When you are operating yourself in country, you'll also need to consider whether things that emerge in that country and that are attributable to you, whether that triggers a need to report problems to the UK Charity Commission, for example, as a serious incident report. If you were to have a major theft, or somebody was severely injured or something like that, that would otherwise require reporting as a serious incident under UK law to the Charity Commission, you may need to do that in respect of activities overseas, which does, again, complicate that sort of situation. Could I have the next slide, please? So partner organisations, and I think in my experience, this is much more common nowadays, and partly driven, again, from the localisation agenda, is that you deliver your projects through a local organisation in jurisdiction, in the relevant jurisdiction. It usually means that you have a contractual relationship of one sort or another. If you start controlling that entity, then we go back to the conversation about, is it a subsidiary of yours? So you may well have the right to sit on a board. They may well welcome management participation, but essentially it's an organisation independent from the UK charity. As I say, this means that you are effectively agreeing a contract with them to use the funding you provided, if that's the main purpose, in order to deliver the outputs you're achieving. Now, those contracts can be very complicated. They are also going to be potentially subject to local laws. I'll come on to this in a moment, but some jurisdictions, it is incredibly difficult to actually get to court to try and enforce your contract. So while the contract might be beautifully crafted, you do also need to understand your ability to actually enforce those contracts and make sure they can be implemented. Lots of organizations do work on this sort of basis with a trusted partner who they know the people, they've perhaps exchanged staff, etc. But it's essentially, the model is you have the right to use my name, and this is perhaps not decolonization in the right way, but the Care International model is, the Care International name and branding is owned by one of the entities, which licenses that out on condition that they follow essentially the rule book, and the rule book will have all sorts of obligations in it, reporting requirements, compliance requirements, etc. So if the worst came to the worst and everything became problematic, essentially you can terminate that license agreement. The other party would no longer be able to use your name and associate with you. It doesn't resolve all the risks, because you've still got a problem with accountability to donors if your money's gone missing, if it's not been applied appropriately. So you will certainly need a funding agreement. And one of the issues about starting to draft a funding agreement is if you've got multiple streams of funding, some of which comes from FCDO or USAID or whoever it may be, they've all got slightly different terms and conditions, slightly different reporting timelines. You have to sort of condense them into one reporting obligation that allows you to get the information from your partner organisation in time to get it back to all your principal funders. So while it sounds quite easy, sometimes it can become quite complicated. You also need to be slightly aware of reputation management, because you will still be held responsible for the delivery of the project, even if your partner does not deliver everything that is intended. And there are associated issues if there's a safeguarding problem, if there's a security problem for staff. So you need to think about that risk as well, where it's not quite within your control. Do you do lots of due diligence and check that their policies are in place and being enforced? So it's a different relationship where you don't have that control aspect. If I could have the next slide, please. Brilliant. So a few other issues, and there are, as I say, a million and one other issues driven by local laws. So forgive me for not answering all those questions, which I know is the ones you really want answering. But should your agreements be subject to local law or subject to English law? Initially, I would say it should be subject to English law, because I'm an English lawyer and it's easier for me to draft them. But if you are delivering services in a particular country, it is perfectly open to that local jurisdiction to say, but the services are being delivered in country, and therefore the local jurisdiction applies regardless of what your contract says. So we will interpret in accordance with Kenyan law or whatever it may be. As I've just touched on, enforceability is also an issue. It's all well and good if you've got a contract that's subject to English law and English courts, but you've still got to enforce it in country against your local partner or whoever it may be. That may not be very easy. So again, there's a slight shift from my perspective to wanting a bit more control, because the contracts are less essential, because you can direct what the partner recipient organisation should be doing via your control rather than through a contractual arrangement. Back-to-back with funder obligations is linking to the reporting requirements. There will be all sorts of other obligations whereby organisations say you must comply with this policy, you must comply with that policy, you must make sure this happens. If you've got multiple versions of that, it does become quite difficult. But you have to pass those obligations one way or another onto your partner organisation, because if your funder says jump, you need to be able to say to your partner organisation, jump, and get the relevant information or do the relevant things. There will be lots of other provisions depending on the nature of the project and the local jurisdiction. Data protection is increasingly an issue wherever you are. I think most instances we say don't share personal data to the extent you can. You can usually use anonymized data, for reports on beneficiary outcomes and things like that. But clearly, as soon as you start sharing individual personal data, you open a much more complex world. Reporting requirements, I think I've probably talked about, is trying to make sure that you can get the information from those partner organisations before you need to report to your own funders. Safeguarding, again, is another issue. The standards perhaps are not the same in every jurisdiction. You can have the best laid policies and all the rest, but whether those policies are implemented is a different question. So you will need to understand what risks there are, who you're working with, how you're working with vulnerable people. Corruption, again, is another issue that people often ask about. And especially if you are operating on the ground through some form of branch structure, then you will be responsible for corruption if it happens within your project. It can also still apply to you because you are obliged to ensure your supply chain has got appropriate bribery provisions in those contracts. But again, in many jurisdictions, it's a bigger issue than it might be in the UK. I think that's probably all I really wanted to say. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, for that. There are a couple of questions. I think we'll ask you to look at those in the chat box directly, just so we can get sort of back onto track. And with that, I'll hand straight over to David.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, lovely to be here. So I thought I would give a bit of perspective from operations. So I'm head of operations at HelpAge International, who are NGO focusing on the rights and well-being of older people around the world. And in 2021, we embarked on a journey that had a number of elements as part of a strategic shift to commit to localization. So three that I'm going to pick out, which I think are relevant to today. One is a shift to a global team. So we moved from a traditional model where we had a headquarters based in London, some regional offices and some country offices. And we shifted that to have a global team, a global platform where we had colleagues in one team spread all over the world, some of them in those previous locations, but increasingly not, could be based anywhere. And some of them are based directly employed through us or through our linked entities as part of the group around the world. Some of them through employers of records has been discussed today, and some of them kind of seconded through partners and partner organizations. So there's a real variety there. The second element of it was transition of our country programs. So we had 13 country offices, and they're going through a localization process. We're about halfway through. Some of them are becoming independent entities in their own country. So we recently launched HelpAge Tanzania and Age Myanmar. Some of them are becoming like units focusing on aging in partners in that country. Some of them are becoming local networks that we bring together, partners focused on aging. And the third element was shifting to partner programming. So certainly some of those considerations that Andrew was just talking about has come through. So increasingly, rather than direct programming, we're shifting totally to partner-led programming. There's always been a history of working through partners at HelpAge, but that's our future as well. We go to the next slide. Thanks. So you're going to pick out a couple of benefits from the global team aspects. Jen covered this really well earlier. I'm going to pick out a few others. So one that I wanted to talk about, the cross-organization information sharing. So we've gone from having, say the finance function, you'd have a few people located in one location. It's really easy to share information, but they may be separate to what's going on in a regional office or other locations. Whereas now that same finance team, you'd have a couple in London, one in Nairobi, one in Colombia, say. So that brings a lot of benefits in terms of sharing information when it works well. The 24-hour operation point Jen touched on before. So at its best, this can work that someone starts working on an issue in Asia in the morning in the UK time. They finish, they can pass the issue or their questions to people based in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and then move on to the Americas and then continue. Now, So at its best, you can have that 24-hour operation. At its worst, you can wake up and have an inbox full of overwhelming amount of information, questions, etc. So there's a real pro and con to that. There's operational scalability and resilience benefits. So rather than if the incident happens or security deterioration, like at the moment in a couple of our locations in the Middle East, if that occurs, it doesn't mean that entire functions are wiped out. Because teams are spread over multiple locations, you've got the resilience to continue operating while supporting those colleagues. And it also can bring us closer to our partners. Go to the next slide, thanks. Some of the challenges. So I think Jen touched on the onboarding and the organisation culture challenges really well earlier. One that I've seen is a balance that we have to put between the benefits of when you bring people together. So outside of remote work, bringing people in person, there is real benefit to that. We also have carbon budget commitments. We're trying to reduce our carbon budget over this decade. So there's a real creative tension, let's say, there between trying to get the best use of our carbon budget to fulfill in-person work. There's also, as an organisation, our kind of organisational language is English, so you can entrench some dominance around the use of that, where people who maybe didn't have English language skills but could operate really well in different contexts, when they come to the global team, that can be an issue. The other one I'd pull out is the duty of care complexities. So particularly where you're employing someone through an employer of record or hosted at a partner, being really clear on who's responsible for what aspects of duty of care, security management. If something was to go wrong, whose umbrella of security they're under and how you're going to cooperate is really important. We've got one example at the moment with a new staff member who's going to be hosted in Sudan, and we're having to be really clear on who's responsible from HelpAge and what capabilities we have to do that. I think we go to the final slide. Picked out a few lessons and tips. So one is budget for unseen costs and advice. So things will come up, interesting legal regimes, things that you weren't expecting in different locations. So definitely budget for that, and time, put time aside for dealing with some of these contingency issues. The other one, technology can definitely do a lot. Like, we're all based remotely, and in terms of this call and interacting, collaborating, Wordly is a really good translation tool we've started using at the moment. But I think there has to be that real focus on the people side as well. I think that really came through from what Jen was saying. Technology is an enabler, but it's necessary but not sufficient. Yeah, thanks very much. I think I'll round up there.
Okay, thanks, David. Just see if some questions coming through. There's the first one. What steps does HelpAge International take to ensure its programs can grow and adapt to changing demands and challenges in the communities you serve?
Yeah, thanks very much, Albert. Yeah, really interesting question. So as part of that shift to partner-led programming, the led bit's really important. So we're working with the partners to co-develop solutions and listening to communities. So part of that is just by boosting the agency of the partner, who are based closer or often embedded in communities. We're going to be more responsive and more aware of what those demands are. And there are things that you can do at the organizational level to try and make that happen and boost that. So, for example, we've recently introduced partner due diligence passporting to try and cut down kind of administrative burden that partners have. They're often doing due diligence exercise with multiple agencies or donors. So we're saying, okay, well, let's see what you've done already and see how we can try and save some time for you. And other ones are trying to build the capacity of partners through things like SHAPE capability, humanitarian capacity boosting, and understanding where we've got areas to learn on, particularly in terms of local context and innovative solutions. So I think there are operational things you can do, but there's also the mindset's really important in terms of listening to partners, trusting that they have their ear to the ground and what demands there are and how we can try and solve them. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Just give it a second, see if any other questions come through. Nothing else. Okay. Well, thanks very much, David. And I'll just hand over to our final speaker, Nick.
Thank you. Hi, folks. I'm Nick Haley from International Alert. We're a peace-building charity of about 250 people in about 20 different places. And I'll try and build a bit on what Jen and David have said, in particular about recruiting our global teams globally. So like David was saying, we've been moving from a model of a headquarters basically in the UK to a headquarters that is globally distributed. And a few reflections. One is that I think it's really important to be clear on what the drivers are for this. So clearly, I think for most of us, the question of decolonization, equity, breaking down power relations is an important driver. But there are others, and it's worth thinking about them. I think my board initially thought that cost was quite a big driver, but it's not actually cheaper in many cases to recruit, say, a strong finance manager in Nairobi than it is to recruit that person in the UK. Diversity and skills is obviously a driver, giving us access to skills in lots of different markets, giving us a more geographically distributed workforce that's closer to our countries, as David said. Absolutely. Career paths was also quite a driver for us. So we're not a huge organization. It's much easier in a globally distributed headquarters to think of the talent pool for our next Africa director or our next executive director to come to be able to work in any of our offices, and therefore to come from our existing staff rather than always having to be filled, for example, in the UK. So that was a driver. A point maybe on decisions. We had quite a big think when we started this about, is this geographically neutral or geographically concentrated? So are we looking for a world where, let's say, all of our finance people are in Kigali and all of our HR people are in wherever and so on? Or is it more the work anywhere model? We went for the work anywhere model for the reasons that I've talked about, but that's really worth having a think about. And are you moving your headquarters or are you distributing your headquarters? We're doing the second of those. Of course, others have done the first, and there are pros and cons for each for different organizations. And then there's the restructuring question. So we decided to do this through turnover rather than restructuring. So as roles come up for recruitment in what had previously been the UK, they're now advertised globally. And lastly, there's a decision on exceptions. So if you're recruiting a fundraiser based whose focus is to be raising money from the US and Europe, that's probably not ideal to base that in Myanmar, just as you wouldn't base your Myanmar lead in London. So we thought quite hard about some of the exceptions to this, or a media officer whose job is to get us in the UK papers, for example. Explaining those exceptions to staff within the context of the overall model is kind of important. Just to add a few of the issues that go beyond, or sort of add a bit to what Jen and David have said. So one is the relationship with the country office of the global team staff who are recruited there. We don't have a work anywhere employer of record model. We advertise jobs where we already have a registration and a country office. But it's different when you're the country director in Rwanda and you've now got the regional director for Africa sitting in your country office. It feels different for you. It feels different for that person. The question of financial support for hosting those roles is important. The question of duty and care and welfare, as David have said, whose job is it to look after that person day to day? How does the country director give feedback on that person's participation in the team, contribution to the office, as well as just the line management chain that might lead to finance or programs or whatever else? That's important. Salaries has been talked about by Jen. We like them. We've gone for a benchmarked model. That does mean that you might have two finance officers doing the same job on quite different salaries because one of them is in a place where the cost of living is higher, and you've just got to be okay with that and have a framework for justifying that equitably and in a benchmarking way. And then one last challenge has been how we advertise our jobs and where. We found that some quite senior jobs that we've advertised globally have attracted what we thought were strong fields, but when candidates have come to interview, they've sometimes not fully conceived that these are headquarters jobs, although they're applying from wherever, that they are looking from a headquarters function across the organization, because people are so used to a job being advertised in Abuja as being a Nigeria or a West Africa job rather than, say, a headquarters job. So we're having to think really hard about how we frame our jobs, what words we use to describe them, how those might be different from what we've habitually done. what advertising channels we use for our recruitment and so on. So there's just a few things to add to Jen and David's reflections on quite similar points. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll just open up. Got a few minutes left. If there's any further questions, either for you or for any of our other speakers, I think most of them are still on yet. So here's a question for you, Nick. Do you have any thoughts on the optimal number of global locations for your organisations? Is it better to be in a few locations with more employees, or to spread the presence in as many places as possible?
So we decided that by default we would advertise our global jobs wherever we have an office, so wherever we have an establishment. There are, as the question hints at, there are some choices around that. So, our people in Lebanon right now are having a pretty tough time. Many of them can't work as they normally would for understandable reasons. So the global team members that we have there, we have to accept that by basing people in that context, there are risks and there are issues associated with that wouldn't occur, wouldn't be as likely to occur in a London or a Nairobi, for example. They might, but they'd be less likely. But we took the anywhere we have a registration approach, but not the work anywhere employer of record approach. And my guess is the answer is different for each organisations. I don't know what David and Jen have.
Yeah, so David's got a reflection on that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, very interesting to hear from your perspective. So yeah, we went otherwise. So we said we have a history in certain locations, but this is a new chapter. So we recruit in those locations, certainly, and we do see, because we have existing networks where we had regional offices and country offices, you do see some clustering there. But over time, we're also seeing more and more new staff being placed in different locations. As Nick indicated, it's definitely a balance, and there's pros and cons. So while it means that our pool of talent we can go to is obviously wider, it also means cognitively and as an organisation, we have to be aware of a much larger number of countries, what's going on, what are the legal regimes. So there's a overhead as well for some of your core operational teams, finance, compliance, HR, to deal with that. It can get more complicated, but that's the direction we have gone.
Yeah, I guess sometimes the question is more it's the operational thing, isn't it? Of ideally how many different places would we be, but then logistically and having to deal with all the local tax and admin can add a bit of complexity to those decisions.
Yeah, and one really operational one we've seen is just getting people equipment. If you have one person on their own in a country, getting the right equipment to them or supporting them to procure it, and then if they leave, what do you do with it, has been a big learning, I'd say, for us to see how to do that. Not easy at all.
Yeah, just looking at, I've got another question come in. This one's a little off topic. It's someone recently graduated with a BA in international development looking for job opportunities. Any advice? I think that's definitely a question for Nick and David again.
One, keep trying. Two, have a think about what, if you want to work in the UK, I don't know if that's what you want or not, but have a think about what UK organisations are now doing more in the UK. For many of us, that's advocacy and fundraising, for example, more than it is, say, programme management or other factors. So have a think about which of those areas most suits you. It's random career advice from me, sorry, unsolicited. Well, no, solicited, so okay.
All the questions we've got at the moment. See if anyone's got any other ones. Otherwise, we'll be on track just to finish a few minutes early. I think as we put in...
I've got a question for you, Andrew.
Yeah, go on.
You auditors with whom we work so closely and enjoy that. All of these things that we NGOs are doing, what's their impact on you? I mean, well, I mean, obviously, partly you've got brilliant people like those who've spoken today who can advise on all of these things. But I mean, are you finding that your job of ensuring our compliance as UK charities is different, more complicated, that you yourselves are thinking about where you do your work?
I'd say it's a mix. I think some of our clients seems to be getting a little bit more straightforward. I think that sort of localization project tends to push more activity out of the UK charity. So in terms of what we're auditing, sometimes we can lose chunks of activity that previously we had to audit sort of remotely or through component auditors, and now they're just sort of gone. I mean, it very much depends on how the international bit is structured. Some charities have a UK sort of group head where everything comes in and goes back out. Others work in different ways where maybe the UK charity is just really a fundraising body and all the activities coordinated from elsewhere. So it is a mix. I think as with all areas, things tend to get more complex as time goes by rather than less. But I suppose the joy of working in audit is that we always have a bit of materiality to work with. So quite often we can end up in a situation where a client is doing something we're fairly confident it's not right. But if it's, one member of staff somewhere, it's unlikely that we're going to have a material problem. So we can recommend that they go and sort it out, but don't have to sort of enforce that. But yeah, definitely all of our clients always tell us that they're very different to their, I wouldn't say competitors, but other similar charities, and they often are, but often not for the reasons they think they are. Yeah, there's no other questions. So I think just to reiterate what's in the chat box there, that the slides will go out today, and recording of this will be online at some point this week, I think that says, and then there is a link there to give feedback. So anyone who's joined, if you can give the feedback, that would be great. But otherwise, I think we'll close, and just a quick thanks to all the speakers and everyone who's been involved in organising.